What is Zionism? One hears lots of stupid things these days. One hears particularly stupid things coming out of the mouths of Ivy League students, which pains me to no end. I spent 6 years of my life at Yale studying Jewish history, and thus know for a fact that if one wants to, one can become an informed person and learn a lot, even at Yale. So here I am, even though it was not my intention of talking much about Israel or Zionism or anything like that on this channel. Here I am. I am literally, check me out. I am literally dusting off my PhD. Unfortunately, it is really dusty. I chipped the frame, which is a damn shame. And I'm going to talk about Zionism. So we need to do two things. Like first, we need to distinguish between traditional religious Jewish Zionism and then modern political Zionism. And then to do that, we're also going to need to talk a little bit about, so this is the second thing, we're going to need to talk about traditional Jewish politics, because there's a contrast between traditional Jewish politics and modern Jewish politics. Now, okay, so traditional Jewish religious Zionism. Judaism, since the very beginning, Genesis, right, has been focused on the Promised Land. I think most of you are familiar with the basic story, God promising the land to Abraham and his descendants, etc., etc. Not just the Promised Land, but then also, particularly in later bits of the Bible, are Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes the real focal point of Jewish identity, Jewish religious observance. It is the north in the compass of Jewish identity, and really has been for at least 3,000 years. With the, I guess I should call it the, when after the Romans committed ethnic cleansing and genocide against Jews, uh, and the first round being the year 70, which is the fall of the temple and fall of Jerusalem, there Judaism really picked up this strong messianic strain, and the idea is that exile is a terrible thing, and but it's God's will, and God brought Jews into exile. God will bring Jews out of Israel and out of exile, and so part of the faith is now aspiring for this messianic era, aspiring for the return of Jews to Israel, and ultimately the restoration of the Davidic monarchy and the resurrection of the dead. I never understood the resurrection of the dead part. It's a lot of people. Like, where are they all going to go? So that's it. I mean, this is normative Judaism, really, for 2,000 years. I mean, for example, the Passover holiday that was just celebrated, it says in the Haggadah, which is itself like somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years old at least, depending on what parts, but certainly one of the older bits says at the very end, next year in Jerusalem, right? And so this is something that Jesus had been saying for basically 2,000 years at the close of the Passover holiday. So it's a big deal. Okay, so that's traditional Jewish Zionism. Modern political Zionism is a different beast. But to explain the difference, we need to talk about traditional Jewish politics. By politics, I mean how Jews interact with the world around them and navigate the world around them, and try to promote their interests vis-a-vis, in the world. Traditionally, Jewish politics can be defined in terms of quietism and what I like to call elite transaction. Quietism refers to this notion that ultimately, because everything is the hands of God, it's really not your place to try to change your status in the world by your own means, since it's up to God. Rather, what you do is you try to change your status in the world, to try to change your fortunes in the world by influencing God, and you influence God by obeying God, through piety. So observation of Jewish law, Jewish ritual observance, Jewish dietary observance, prayer, charity, tzedakah, that's it, it's piety. Now, in terms of what I mean by elite transaction, most Jewish communities, most of the time, pretty much everywhere in the world, were organized as corporate entities. Individual Jews were never granted liberties or permission to stay anywhere. It's rather Jews as a community were granted permission, tolerance in communities, kingdoms, whatever. And the basis of that tolerance of the Jewish community was almost always transactional in one way or another. And usually that transaction was negotiated by some rich Jew. Most of the vast majority of Jews in anywhere in the world, most of the time, were desperately poor. But there was always a few who had money, and there's often one who had a lot of money. And the guy who had a lot of money was often the guy who was the go-between between the community and the prince, because let's call him the prince, because he had access, right? And he had some influence. And what the prince wanted was money, usually, or some essential service. Usually the deal was something like, in exchange for money, cash, the Jewish community would get, first of all, permission to live. Second of all, autonomy over their own affairs. So they would take care of their own stuff. And this was the deal that usually worked out, and it worked a lot of the time. Although often what happened was that the prince, because he was impatient and wanted a lot more cash now, he would shake down the Jewish community, or he would fleece them. He'd steal their money and kick them out. That happened plenty of times. So, but that's it. That's Jewish politics. Now, with the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, there's now a new form of politics that emerges, which is the what I call the liberal offer. And basically, what happens is that in 1791, the National Assembly emancipated the Jews of France. And now Jews have this option of achieving liberty and security through integration. They can become citizens, they can benefit from liberty before the law, equality before the law. They can integrate, maybe they can assimilate, and this is great. And then now that they're doing this, and now that they're acting as citizens, then Jews also found different ways of navigating inside the non-Jewish world, using various much more political things that we would recognize as sort of modern forms of politics. They vote, for example, Jews vote. So things start to change. So the liberal offer is something that a lot of Jews got really excited by. Some Jews in Germany, for example, once they got emancipated, they were so excited about this that they thought that they could speed things along by aping German Protestants, by basically thinking, if we look like German Protestants and speak like German Protestants and dress like German Protestants and have religious services like German Protestants and even think like German Protestants, the German Protestants would accept us more, and this would hasten our integration into German society. They're going to love us. Editor's note, they were all murdered anyways. But anyways, that's the reform movement. That's where that came from. So the emancipation went from Western Europe, from France to Central Europe, and then a little bit in Eastern Europe, but not so much, particularly not in the Russian Empire. And that's significant because the Russian Empire is where the vast majority of the world's Jews lived. Now, also during the 19th century, two things happened. There were two developments, both of which are essential for understanding what Zionism is. The first is nationalism. The world was divided into empires. And in all these empires, you had these communities, ethnic communities, linguistic communities, whatever, that identified themselves or came to identify themselves as nations. And then they began to aspire politically for some sort of national autonomy or sovereignty. This was everywhere. I'm thinking about Greek nationalists, Bulgarian nationalists, Hungarian nationalists, Polish nationalists, Italian nationalists, German nationalists, Czech nationalists. I mean, whatever, you name it, everybody, right? This is just a new paradigm of thinking in the 19th century, and how communities thought about how best to secure their liberties and how best to flourish in the world. They thought that they needed to do it as a nation state, as a sovereign nation state. This was thus in the air. The second thing that happened in the 19th century is that, particularly in the Russian Empire, where again, the vast majority of Jews lived, things got really, really bad. There was tremendous anti-Jewish violence. There were pogroms in the 1870s, pogroms in the 1880s. I think the 1790s might have been relatively quiet, but then you have terrible pogroms in Russia, in the Russian Empire, between 1903, 1905. There were pogroms before the World War I. There were pogroms during World War I. There were pogroms after World War I. I mean, people think that it's like the Holocaust that's the justification for Zionism, but in reality, it actually all happened before. It's the massacres of the 1880s and the 1900s and 1919. Like, that's the stuff that propelled the creation of Zionism, propelled people to become Zionists. So as part of this process, as things are going on, the West, by and large, didn't have pogroms, but the West had problems. So everywhere in the West, even in Britain and France, where everybody was super liberal, there were always instances of anti-Semitism and persecution and discrimination. I mean, the most notorious example being the Dreyfus Affair. All of this added up to rattle a certain number of Jews, and to make a certain number of Jews, or encourage a certain number of Jews, to conclude two things. First, that they would never find safety. Jews would never really be accepted in Europe. That the Europeans, even though many of them are really very nice, will never be able to get over their hatred of Jews, Judeophobia, some called it, or anti-Semitism, it came to be known as. Uh, they never would. Secondly, the solution, remember the ambient nationalism, the solution was self-determination in a sovereign state. So therefore, the idea became to seek self-determination in a sovereign state, being a recreation of the Jewish nation state in the Jewish ancestral homeland, which had been the Jewish nation state until the Romans committed genocide and ethnic cleansing. So that's the idea. So the first guy to start thinking like this, where's that book? Moses Hess. This is his book. It's called Roman Jerusalem. It's actually a really good book. Published in 1861. Moses Hess was a really interesting guy because he was a German radical. He was a colleague and sometime collaborator of Karl Marx. Like that's the crowd that he ran with. But then at some point, I don't actually know enough about him to know, but at some point he basically said, like, screw this, they hate us, they're always going to hate us. What we need is a nation state. Hess was kind of a one-off. But soon after, one by one, two by two, three by three, other Jews started to think along the same lines. And, from these ones and twos and threes, they began to sort of aggregate. I want to say coagulate, but that's kind of an awful word. Aggregate. And then before you know it, this becomes a kernel, and then a snowball, and then it snowballs, and that becomes a full-blown movement. So, for instance, you've got Leon Pinsker, who published Auto-Emancipation in 1882, I believe in response to the pogroms of 1881, in which he also says, look, they're always going to hate us. The Judeophobia is too baked into the European DNA. So, um, so what we need is our own nation. And he says we need to join the family of nations. That's the term that he used, right? It's a very 19th century concept. Then you have more and more Zionists of all stripes. You have socialist Zionists and anti-socialist Zionists and religious Zionists and anti-religious Zionists. And then you have religious socialist Zionists and religious anti-socialist Zionists and every possible combination. The most famous of all these ultimately is Theodor Herzl, Der Judenstaat, who wrote this book, if you could see it. The Jewish State, published in, I should have looked this up, I think it's like 1896. By the way, I learned German specifically so that I could read Heinrich Kretz, the German Jewish historian. However, the first German book that I read, as soon as I had the ability to read anything in German, was Das doppelte Lottchen, the children's book by Erich Kästner. It's the basis of the Disney movie, the Parent Trap. Great book. And then I read Heidi, which is also great. And then the third book I read was Der Judenstaat, because, of course, how else do you follow up on Heidi than with Theodor Herzl? That was my logic at the time. It's a weird book, Der Judenstaat. Conceptually, it's not great. I think Moses Hess is better. I think a lot of other writers were better. But Herzl's important because he brought to the Zionist movement organization, leadership, charisma. He raised the profile of it. He was just a really good leader. So let's bring this all together. What is Zionism? And if you look at Hess and Pinsker and Herzl and all the others, the hundreds of other Zionist writers, there are certain common denominators, and all boils down to the following. Zionism is nothing more or less than the belief in Jewish self-determination in a sovereign state. That's it. And from my point of view, it's no different from Italian nationalism or Hungarian nationalism. It's the same basic idea. In the words of one of my favorite French Jewish writers, Albert Memmi, who's Tunisian and he picked up his Zionism growing up in Tunis, he wrote that a Zionist is someone who, quote, having observed that the Jewish condition is one of oppression, finds it legitimate to reconstruct a Jewish state, to bring an end to that oppression and to return to Jews, like other people, the dimensions of being free men, unquote. Or, he continues elsewhere, a Zionist is one who, quote, believes in the desirability of the liberation of the Jew as such, unquote. And that is Zionism. Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe. Also check out my Substack, Pax Americana, link in the description. Check out my website, michaelshirkin.com, also link in the description. And you can come find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I put links to some of the books, my recommended reading on the subject down below. Buying books through my links is also a really great way to support this channel at no extra cost to you. So at any rate, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye bye.